Week 7 of the fantasy football season was one of the lowest scoring weeks for the wide receiver position in recent memory. There were only 23 wide receivers in week 7 that scored 10 plus fantasy points. To put that in perspective, usually there's 30 plus. But now thankfully this week we have no bye week, so that means we're going to have more high scoring wide receivers, right? What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone's doing well out there today. We're talking about wide receivers, all the fantasy viable wide receivers here in week 8. And I don't know if you've really noticed this or not. We've talked about it for years at the running back position, how teams are going to committees, right? No longer just one workhorse. Well, honestly, same type of thing is happening at the wide receiver position as well. Teams used to utilize like 2 or 3 wide receivers a week consistently. Now it's like 5 plus. It's making it harder and harder to determine which guys are going to be the best plays weekly, especially when bye weeks and injuries are involved. Trust me, this is causing bald spots and receding hairlines all over the world. But speaking of all over the world, I need to continue to do my part to try to make a difference in this world. So if you're not interested, there are timestamps down below, but I'm going to continue to try to find ways to get more children throughout this world sponsored and taken care of and brought out of extreme poverty. So far, year to date with our partnership with Compassion International, we've gotten 6 kids sponsored, but we have a goal of 58 kids by Super Bowl 58, so we still have 52 more to go. So you better believe we're gonna keep doing our Compassion Kid of the Week, because I would like nothing more than for these kids to be sponsored in time for the holidays so they can really start seeing some of that joy and love at a time that so many people are experiencing the same type of thing. So let's meet this week's Compassion Kid of the Week. It's Abigail. She's only 2 years old. She lives in Uganda, and she has been waiting for a sponsor for 566 days. Is there anyone out there in the Headliner Nation community that is able to help this little girl change her life? If there is, I have a link down below in the description. It's www.compassion.com/headliners. You can also see her child ID on the screen. We flashed it up there with her picture. You can actually go search by a child's ID and look for Abigail herself. Now, maybe you do that and you find out she's already been sponsored. That is great for her, but there are still thousands of other kids on that site that we can make a difference and help out with. So if you're able to help us reach our goal of 58 kids by Super Bowl 58, now is the time to do so. Like I said, there is a link down below in the description to Compassion's website. Would love to see these kids sponsored, absolutely. If you've already done this, I've been asking this for weeks. If you already sponsor a child on Compassion, I know a lot of people do, just leave a comment down below in the comment section. Let people know about your experience with Compassion International so they know they aren't getting into something that they really don't want to. It is a great company to work for, and I love that partnership. But now, let's go ahead and talk some football. Let's head into the Thursday night football matchup between the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and Buffalo Bills. And let's be honest, if the same Buffalo Bills defense that we saw in week 7 shows up in week 8, we could be in for another big Mike Evans day. Right now, he's wide receiver 15 overall, averaging 14.3 fantasy points per game on average, but I'm not blind to the fact that this guy needs touchdowns, right? He's not racking up huge yardage each and every week. He's being saved by touchdowns, but luckily, he continues to get touchdown opportunities, and that's exactly what we're looking for. But we've also seen a bump recently here in the volume going the way of Chris Godwin. He's averaged 10 targets a game now over his last 3 games played. And really, when you look at his numbers a little bit closer, even though this year seems so much less than last year, he's really only averaging 1 reception less per game and 2 yards per game less than what he did last season. So he's really not that far off of last year's pace, but now they get this matchup going up against Buffalo, and they allow 26.1 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and have now allowed over 250 yards passing in 3 of their last 4 games. When we look at the injury situation here, both Baker Mayfield and Chris Godwin are on the injury report currently with minor injuries, but they should be good to go. It's the jinx of Thursday night football that will always be there, though. I hate Thursday night football games when it comes to fantasy football. It is so hard to predict teams in a very short week. Mike Evans, for me, still going to be a top 20 option overall. Godwin, also going to be inside my top 36, so be sure to stay tuned to the rankings. What about for the Buffalo Bills. We got Stefon Diggs. We know that we never, ever bench Stefon Diggs. 10 plus fantasy points now in every game this season. The overall wide receiver 2 has had over 100 yards receiving in 5 of the 7 games this season and is on pace for the best year of his career. But Gabe Davis, on the other hand, remains 100% touchdown dependent, and now he hasn't had a touchdown in his last 2 games played. Dude only had 27 total yards over his last 2 games combined. But is this the week that he finds the end zone again? We've been predicting him pretty good majority of the season, but I don't know if I smell it this week. Tampa Bay allows 29.4 fantasy points per game to wide receivers, but have only allowed 4 receiving touchdowns to wide receivers since week 2. The yardage could definitely be there, but the touchdowns are hard to come by. This defense is a little bit banged up in Buffalo, so they could give up points once again, forcing them to have to throw for all 4 quarters, which is great. But with the way that we've seen this offense kind of struggle here as of late, the way they've played overall in Buffalo, and Gabe Davis's lack of production, he is going to remain a huge risk for us here this week. Stefon Diggs, we obviously know he's a safer guy that we can lock and load each and every week. Davis is a guy that can explode, but on paper, this just isn't the best opportunity for him. But then we're going to head over to Sunday football, where we got a lot of there's some matchups out there that are going to be straight bangers here in week 8. Let's go ahead and kick it off, though, with the Houston Texans and Carolina Panthers. Now, Houston's going to be fresh off their bye week as well. Nico Collins looking to pick up where he left off. The current wide receiver 13 overall, and he just continues to be a big-time deep ball threat. He's number 3 overall among all wide receivers in yards per reception. He's also number 3 overall among all wide receivers in yards after the catch. The guy is averaging almost 19 yards per reception. But this offense could also be getting back Tank Dell this week, who missed a game prior to the bye with a concussion. Now, Tank hasn't been overly consistent, but we really have to blame the volume. In both of the games in which he saw at least 7 targets, he scored at least 16.5 fantasy points. Feed the young man the football. Now they got a matchup going up against Carolina. They allow 26.3 fantasy points per game to wide receivers, and we know that Houston hasn't been able to run very much with that offensive line being in shambles. I'm hoping that the bye week was able to get them a little bit healthier, but they're not going to be 100%. Nico Collins is still going to be the safer option in this offense due to his efficiency, but Tank Dell, for me, has some of that week 8 sleeper upside. If he can get 7+ targets, he could be a solid flex play for your fantasy team here this week. On the other side of the football, the Carolina Panthers coming off their bye week as well, and I know a lot of people are pumped to have Adam Thielen back in their lineup. He's the current wide receiver 7 overall. He's had over 11 fantasy points now in 5 straight ball games. He's averaging like a manscaped hair, under 10 targets per game on the season, and in 3 of his last 4 games has had over 100 yards receiving. Not any really other wide receivers to talk about in Carolina either. DJ Chark has only had 1 game all year over 3 receptions, and he's brought in less than half of his targets overall. Terrace Marshall had 1 good game with volume and then disappears. Jonathan Mingo, he hasn't broken 50 yards in a game yet. Now a matchup going up against Houston. They allow 22.6 fantasy points per game. That is 5th fewest in the NFL. Most of the injuries in Carolina are going to be on the defensive side of the football. We're waiting to see whether or not we get Miles Sanders back, but even if we don't, Chuba Hubbard been just fine. Coming off the bye week, though, it is definitely worth noting that Bryce Young's binky Adam Thielen is going to be the safest option here once again. Everyone else in this offense a little bit too big play dependent. I'm going to chase the volume in this one, and it's going to continue to be Adam Thielen. How about we go down to Dallas now for the Cowboys and the Rams? We'll kick it off with the Rams here, and sure, we saw Cooper Kupp have a little bit of a down game while we saw Puka go the hell off in week 7. But these two remained weekly must-starts pretty much at this point going forward, right? Puka, the overall wide receiver 4. Kupp is averaging over 15 fantasy points per game. These two accounted for 19 of the 29 pass attempts just last week, and there is no sign of that changing. Here's a little bit of a fun fact for you. Matthew Stafford has thrown a total of 256 passes this season. Between Puka and Kupp, they were targeted 110 of those times. That's 43% of the time in this offense. However, remember, Cooper Kupp's only played 3 weeks. So over the last 3 weeks, out of 90 pass attempts from Matthew Stafford, 58 have gone to Puka or Kupp. That is 65%. The volume is going to be there weekly for these guys, and that's what makes them weekly must-starts at this point. Now going up against Dallas, they allow 21.4 fantasy points per game to wide receivers, but they have allowed now over 200 yards receiving in 3 straight ball games. No new injuries in LA, and this is more so about volume than anything else. Like I said, we know there aren't going to be a lot of passing touchdowns that go around in this offense, but as long as you play any type of PPR scoring, these two guys cannot be sat. Now, I don't hate Tutu Atwell. He's just a little bit more touchdown dependent, and like we just said, not a lot of touchdowns to go around in this offense. It's going to make him really boom or bust. For Dallas, it was great to finally see CeeDee Lamb get some usage before the bye week against the Los Angeles Chargers. But even in a close game, in a game in which he kind of complained a little bit that he wanted to see more volume, he still only had 7 targets. Only one game all year with more than 7 targets for CeeDee Lamb is absolutely nuts. He's averaging 2 targets per game less than what he did in 2022. We also have Michael Gallup and Brandon Cooks, but they really haven't proven to be anything consistent either. Cooks had a TD in week 6, but only 36 yards receiving, which was that was a season high for Brandon Cooks. Michael Gallup, only 1 game over 60 yards receiving this season and doesn't have a touchdown yet this year. Now they're going up against LA. They allow 21.9 fantasy points per game, which is 4th fewest in the NFL. There's no new injuries here in Dallas. They're fresh coming off the bye week, but Lamb is still the only wide receiver that we can consider weekly in this offense, and even he is starting to drop down the rankings each and every week. If this guy could get anywhere near 10 targets a game, he's a top 10 wide receiver easy. For whatever reason, 7 seems to be like his ceiling when it comes to targets, and that is absolutely stupid. All right, let's move on to Minnesota and Green Bay. Now, we'll start off in Minnesota, and we just saw in week 7 why I was so high on Jordan Addison this offseason as my highest ranked rookie wide receiver. I talked about what he could do in this offense, and honestly, he just continues to get a little bit better. 6 touchdowns through 7 games. I didn't see that many touchdowns coming from, but it's obviously helping with no Justin Jefferson. He also just had his first 100-yard receiving game, and he's starting to gain Kirk Cousins' trust a little bit more, and you absolutely love to see that. As for KJ Osborne and Brandon Powell, they've been solid. They're nowhere near the ceiling of Jordan Addison, though. Addison is clearly the top wide receiver threat in this offense right now. The only other guy that you can really look at down the field consistently, maybe TJ Hawkinson, but now they're going up against Green Bay, and they allow 24.8 fantasy points per game, 10th fewest in the league, but we do not know whether or not they're going to have defensive back Jair Alexander back this week or not. When it comes to injuries in Minnesota, we need them to get that offensive line a little bit healthier. Offensive guard Ezra Cleveland, hopefully he can come back this week. He's currently questionable on the injury report right now. But for me, this has a lot to do with momentum and confidence in Minnesota. They've started to turn the corner a little bit in Minnesota, and we've seen this team go on a run before when they gain some confidence. Now that we're starting to see Jordan Addison more and more each week, he's the guy that I'm targeting in this offense, even though this isn't going to be an easy matchup. But then when you go down to Green Bay, we once again are dealing with a Christian Watson injury. And this was our issue with this guy all offseason. It wasn't the quarterback play. It wasn't a skill level for him. He just can't stay on the field. The guy has only played a total of 131 snaps this season and has a total of 8 catches for 143 yards, and we're entering week 8. Romeo Doubs, on the other hand, he continues to be the little bit more reliable play in the Green Bay offense, but they can't even get him consistent volume. He only has 9 targets, 3 receptions, and 34 yards over the last 2 games combined. Now they get a matchup going up against Minnesota, which isn't a bad matchup on paper. They allow over 32 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but that defense did look pretty good against San Francisco on Monday Night Football. We really need to monitor this injury to Christian Watson, because we also know that Luke Musgrave was spotted in a walking boot after the Week 7 game. We may be in for a huge Romeo Doubs target game if neither one of these guys can go here this week. I really feel bad for Packers fans, though. This offense isn't as bad as they're playing. They're really trying to overcomplicate things. They're trying to be a little bit too cute. Jordan Love is playing really good football. Let the guy cook down the field. And for those of you that are screaming about Jayden Reed, he only has 4 catches for 28 yards over his last 2 games combined as well. He's not somebody that we can trust as of right now. Everyone has some risk, and until we can find out more about Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs is the one guy, if I had to pick one, he'd be where I go. All right, now let's go down to New Orleans and Indianapolis. Let's start off with New Orleans. And as for Chris Andretti, Chris Olave out there, it's great to see his volume return. The problem is he getting that dirty volume, y'all. Only 67% of his targets have been catchable. It's why he hasn't had a 100-yard game since week 3. Now, Michael Thomas, it's not much better. He hasn't had over 65 yards in a game and has only scored over 10 fantasy points one time all year. Now they're going up against Indianapolis. They allow 27.7 fantasy points per game. Juwan Johnson could be on his way back, but there are 3 members of the offensive line that are currently questionable to play in Landon Young, Ryan Ramczyk, and James Hurst. That's not a good thing for the New Orleans Saints. The volume is going to continue to be there for Olave, and that's what's going to make him a little bit safer. I would really love if he could get some more catchable targets this week going up against Indianapolis, because we all know that Olave possesses that game-breaking speed. He has the ability to go from 35 to 70 and get a big touchdown play in a moment's notice, and that's what we need from him here this week going up against Indianapolis. Come on, Derek, you got to deliver some cleaner balls, my friend. We need cleaner balls to Olave. Now we'll talk about the Indianapolis Colts. And I know Michael Pittman owners were absolutely ecstatic in the late stages of that game in week 7. On the day leading up to that big play to end the game, Michael Pittman had 1 catch for 8 yards. Everybody was like, oh crap, I started the wrong dude. And then all of a sudden, due to a little bit of bad defense and a broken tackle, a 75-yard touchdown absolutely saved the day for Michael Pittman. But now we have a lot of people wondering if Josh Downs needs to be a weekly start as well. I don't know if I'm quite there yet. He also had a big play due to a free play. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, the defense was offsides. They let the play continue. Gardner Minshew just hucked it down the sidelines. The defense had basically stopped for Cleveland, and Josh Downs took it to the house. If you take away that one busted play, he only had 4 catches for 66 yards. The week prior, 5 catches for 21 yards, and only 2 games all year with more than 57 yards receiving. So I don't know if I can look at that and be like, yeah, that dude is a weekly must start as of right now. Especially in a little bit more of a difficult matchup this week going up against the New Orleans Saints, who allow only 26 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, which is 11th fewest. We do know that tight end Kylen Granson is out, but now we also do know that one of these wide receivers, more than likely Michael Pittman, is going to have to deal with Marshon Lattimore, who is a very tough matchup on the opposite side of the field. Pittman, in my opinion, going to be a little bit more big play dependent, but with that difficult matchup, I could see a little bit more volume going the way of Josh Downs this week to avoid Marshon Lattimore. Neither one of these guys are going to be risk-free, though. It's not a great matchup, and we're really going to be dependent on one of these guys finding the end zone here this week. All right, now let's go down to New England and Miami. And I've said for weeks that I really have little to no interest in the passing game of the New England Patriots, and if I'm being honest, I really still don't, especially in a week with no bye weeks. But Kendrick Bourne has now put together decent back-to-back games, and he's the current wide receiver 25 overall in fantasy football, so we'll talk about him here for a second. Over the last 2 games, he's had 18 targets for 16 receptions and at least 60 yards receiving in each one of those games. So even though the ceiling isn't going to be very high in PPR leagues, he does have some flex appeal due to the volume that he's going to receive, especially in a game like this going up against Miami. Miami allows over 31 fantasy points per contest, 9th most in the league to opposing wide receivers. Plus, we know Juju still questionable to play. Has Juju really even played at all this year? I don't even know if he really even matters at this point. But Bourne isn't going to be somebody that I rank super high in my rankings, but in a matchup like this, with the way they're throwing the ball to him lately, he could be somebody who sneaks into the top 30 overall in this week's rankings if you're looking for some sort of a safer flex play in PPR leagues. Their opponents, the Miami Dolphins. And I think we know that we start Tyreek Hill every single week at this point. Dude is like perma-locked into your lineup. He could actually cross the 1,000-yard receiving mark this week. He's at 902. So if he can get 98 yards receiving, he'll be over 1,000 on the year. He's on pace for the best season of his career. Now, Jalen Waddle, I know, was somewhat of a disappointment, but he looked good last week. It absolutely sucked that he missed almost half the game game due to back spasms, but it's a good sign that he still has at least 5 catches now in 3 straight ball games, and he's not too far behind his 2022 pace. He's one big game away, and I think we can all agree that the Miami Dolphins offense is capable of putting together those one big days. Now they're going up against New England, though. They allow 26.3 fantasy points per contest and have allowed over 250 yards passing now in 3 of their last 4 ball games. We could see some success with these wide receivers again. We also know this offensive line continues to be banged up in Miami, and Jalen Waddle's back spasms seem to be something that he's already worked his way through, and he should be a full go. This is going to sound like a broken record, but I'm going to say the same things every single week when it comes to the offense of the Miami Dolphins. You really can't afford to sit the pieces of this offense. They can win you a matchup all by themselves. Now, while Waddle may fall a little bit further down the rankings, he's still going to be a guy that I consider a weekly start inside my top 30 each and every week. All right, now we're going to go down to the New York Jets and New York Giants, and this is just one of those matchups that don't bring a lot of excitement to the pass catching game on either side of the football. We all know that we love Garrett Wilson, but his ceiling is like tree fort height at this point. No 100-yard games this year, no touchdowns since week 2. He's had double-digit targets in only 2 of the 6 games he's played, and he's really one of those guys that it absolutely sucks to sit because you drafted him so highly, and he's such a good player that you have such high hopes you don't ever want to sit him. Now he's going up against the Giants. They allowed 29.5 fantasy points per game, which is 12th most in the league to wide receivers. Most of the injuries here in New York on the Jets, they're going to be on the defensive side of the football. But like usual, Garrett Wilson's going to find himself in that wide receiver 3 range, kind of somebody you can put in your flex play, maybe give you a safer floor, but the guy just doesn't have a very high ceiling, and that absolutely continues to suck. On the other side of the football for the Giants, I'm not interested at all. People keep telling me each and every week down below in the comment section how much I'm sleeping on Wan'Dale Robinson. Really though? I mean, really? Because the guy has had less than 40 yards receiving in 4 of his 5 games played. If I told the audience that they were sleeping on a player and told everyone to start said player, and he went out and had 1 damn catch for 22 yards, there would be some pissed off viewers in this community. So no, I'm not sleeping on Wan'Dale Robinson. This offense isn't any good, and we have no idea who the quarterback is going to be. Until we can see some production consistently, I'm not interested. Now he's going up against the Jets. They allow 18.9 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That is the lowest in the NFL. The whole damn offensive line is hurt. Daniel Jones still isn't 100%. Now I will say this, I do love the fact that I saw Jalen Hyatt get a season high in targets with 5 in week 7. He had 2 catches for 75 yards with those 5 targets. I talked about him this offseason as being a deep sleeper in this offense. The dude is a walking big play, and very few defensive players can hang with him step for step. I would really hope that they start to give him more opportunities going forward, because he could be the guy second half of the season that may become somewhat fantasy viable if they continue to throw him the rock. All right, now we're going to go down to Jacksonville and Pittsburgh. We'll start off with Jacksonville. And really, no one here should be surprised to see that Christian Kirk is all the way up to wide receiver 17 overall on the season. But damn, that late touchdown in week 7 was huge for so many people. We were actually in Discord, all the members we were talking, and a member in our Discord said, man, I need a huge Christian Kirk touchdown right here, and I'll be damned if it wasn't the next play that had happened. It was awesome to be a part of that. But when you look at his overall numbers, he's actually on pace to have a better year this year than he had in 2022. Plus, he's had touchdowns now in back-to-back ball games. As for Calvin Diddley, he just continues to be a decoy for whatever reason in this offense. Not at the beginning of any progressions. He's getting wide open, but he's not getting the targets. He's making great catches, but they're just not counting. I don't know if you missed it or not, but there was a catch last week that they ruled him out of bounds on. Had they challenged it, Calvin Ridley made a ridiculous deep ball catch down the sideline, and his team didn't even challenge it. The luck just continues to be horrible for Calvin Diddley as we continue to go on in this fantasy season, and I really don't understand why. If they're not going to use the guy, just trade him away again, because he is open if you actually watch the film. Now they're going up against Pittsburgh. They allow 35.5 fantasy points per game. That's second most in the league. Zay Jones still questionable to play. We do not know whether or not he's going to be out there, but I get that a lot of people are benching Calvin Ridley as of right now, and I really can't fault you for that. But I will say that there are going to be games at some point remainder of the season where he is going to go off. So if he puts up a big number on your bench, just know that that is definitely a possibility. Like I said, if you actually watch the tape and not just look at box scores, Calvin Ridley is playing some dang good football, and this is just such a huge disappointment. But as of right now, like we've said for multiple weeks, Christian Kirk, the safer option. For Pittsburgh, it was great to see not only Diontae Johnson return, but actually see him get targeted quite a bit in his return. Both him and Pickens were targeted over 6 times apiece. But you really have to expect that his snaps are going to continue to increase here week after week. He played 66% of the snaps just last week. Now, Pickens has back-to-back 100-yard games right now and continues to produce when he gets volume. Keyword, when he gets volume. He's had 3 games this season in which he saw 8+ targets. All 3 of those games resulted in over 100 yards receiving. I would think, I'm not an Einstein here. I'm not an NFL head coach, but I would think, given that information, I'm going to do whatever I can to get George Pickens at least 8 targets a week, especially in a game going up against Jacksonville. They allow over 30 fantasy points per game to wide receivers, 10th most in the league. We've lost Pat Freiermuth now to the IR. Jacksonville is way easier to throw on than they are to run on. So both of these guys, Diontae Johnson and George Pickens, could have a safe floor for us here in week 8. Now, we also know that there's not a lot of passing touchdowns in this offense as well. In the ceiling games, they're going to be somewhat sporadic and really spread out throughout the season, but both of these guys could find their way inside my top 30 here in week 8. Which will now take us down to Tennessee for the Falcons and the Titans, and we just saw Drake London's 3-game streak of double-digit fantasy points come to an end in week 7, but he did still, however, have 7 targets and 6 receptions, but just couldn't really get down the field at all, only averaged 9 yards per reception, which was his lowest of the season so far. He did still, however, lead the team in all receiving categories once again in week 7, so I'm really not overly concerned going forward, but now they get a matchup going up against Tennessee. They allow over 31 fantasy points per game, 8th most to opposing wide receivers. I'm guessing we should have Bijan back from his headache this week, because that made a whole lot of sense in week 7, but this is going to be a much better matchup this week for Drake London than what he saw last week. He's going to be a Verge top 24 play for me once again here this week. For DeAndre Hopkins, he is going to be a huge risk this week. We already know that we do not have Ryan Tannehill, and it sounds like we're going to get Will Levis, who's going to make his very first ever NFL start. If for some reason we don't, it means we get Malik Willis, and he hasn't ever thrown for over 100 yards in a game yet. So a whole lot of unknown here, and a whole lot of not knowing what to expect with this offense, especially in a matchup going up against Atlanta. They're already a tough defense. They allow 23 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, 6th fewest in the league. Plus, we still don't know for sure about Treylon Burks. He hasn't been on the field in what feels like forever, but DeAndre Hopkins for the majority of this season has been a borderline start with a healthy Ryan Tannehill in an offense that we kind of knew what to expect. Now he has some unproven quarterback play to deal with, and I don't know if I want to risk it that much in week 8 with the amount of options that we have, so that's why he's labeled as a huge overall risk. Now let's go down to Philadelphia and Washington. And when you talk about Philadelphia, there has been so much talk in the NFL and in fantasy football about Tyreek Hill and his chance at 2,000 yards, but I feel like everyone's pretty much overlooking A.J. Brown. Right now, he's on pace for 126 receptions, 1,964 yards, and 7 touchdowns, and is one of only 3 players in NFL history to have 5 straight games over 125 yards receiving. But on the other hand, we once again saw the volume fall off for Devontae Smith. He had 11 targets in week 6, and then right back down to 5 targets in week 7. That's now 3 straight games under 50 yards receiving, and he doesn't have a touchdown since week 2. But now they get such a great matchup going up against Washington. They allow almost 33 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That is 5th most in the NFL. No other major injuries in the passing game here, but it's really Devontae Smith that we need to focus on a little bit, right? Because we already know we're going to start A.J. Brown. He was able to have one of his better games against this same Washington team back in week 4, where he had 7 catches for 78 yards. But with A.J. Brown being on this historic pace, you have to expect they're going to continue to feed him the ball a lot. Devontae Smith, for the first time in years, may fall outside of my top 30 wide receiver rankings going into week 8. That's definitely something to pay attention to. For their opponents, you got the Washington Commandos, you got Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson and Curtis Samuel, and now almost 8 weeks into the season, I can see exactly why Eric Bieniemy never got any of those head coaching jobs. He was covered up by the play of Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce for many years. He's trying to do in Washington what he did in Kansas City, and I'm sorry to tell you, but Sam Howell isn't Patrick Mahomes, and there is no Travis Kelce on this team in Washington. This offense is an overall train wreck. They need to switch it up. Go back to what worked at times already this season. Short to intermediate throws. Utilize the likes of Curtis Samuel and Logan Thomas. Run the damn football. I know your offensive line isn't great. I know you're not going to be a run-first team, but you need to control time of possession. You need to keep that horrible defense that you have off the field a little bit more, because what's happening is you're trying to go out there and gunsling early in the game. You're falling behind early because your defense is on the field so damn much, and then you're trying to play catch-up for 4 quarters. There is really just no identity here in this overall offense, and if they're going to win some games, they need to figure that out super soon here, because now they're going up against Philadelphia. But Philadelphia allows a crap ton of points to opposing wide receivers at over 34 per game. No other major injuries on the offensive side of the football here for Washington. Now, when these teams faced off in week 4, Terry McLaurin, Jahan Dotson, and Curtis Samuel all had 8+ targets, and it was a super close game that they took to overtime. Now, McLaurin has gotten a little bit more consistent here as of late. He's had at least 80 yards receiving in 3 of his last 4 games played. Curtis Samuel kind of remains touchdown dependent. Josh Dotson, he hasn't had more than 43 yards receiving in a game this year. All these guys are going to be a risk going forward because there is no set game plan in this offense. Each week, it seems like they're just winging it, but this is a good matchup where there's going to be an opportunity to put some points on the board. If I had to choose one, it's still Terry McLaurin. All right, now we're going down to Seattle. For the Cleveland Browns and Seattle Seahawks, will start off in Cleveland. And the quarterback play the last couple of weeks has absolutely tanked the production of Amari Cooper. He's gotten 22 targets over his last 3 games, which isn't bad, but he's only caught 7 of them. On the year, he's only received 59% catchable targets. The dude out there getting that dirty volume as well. He actually ranks 89th among all pass catchers in catchable target rate. The guy is just... he's fighting for his life to get anything near his body at this point. Even Elijah Moore, who's not going deeper down the field like Amari, he's struggling to get catchable balls as well. The whole Deshaun Watson fiasco is just so hard to trust. There's already rumors coming out that he may not play this week. Great, because he's not going to be in my starting lineup until I see him play 100% healthy. Because when we turned the film on last week, he didn't even look close to healthy. I have no idea what they were looking at in Cleveland. There was no accuracy, and his arm strength just wasn't there. And then once he left the game to be checked for a concussion, was cleared, and didn't return, that was a red light for everyone right there. But now they're going up against Seattle. On paper, it says they allow 34 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but they have been playing way, way better over the last 3 to 4 games here this season. And rookie defensive back Devin Witherspoon, that dude is the real deal. When it comes to injuries in Cleveland, we know Jerome Ford, he's dealing with a high ankle sprain, and then the shoulder of Deshaun Watson. So now that we know that no one in Cleveland is capable of telling the truth with their players, it makes it super hard to trust any of their pass catchers. PJ Walker obviously can't get catchable targets to anyone consistently in this offense. They're going to remain big play dependent. They're going to remain touchdown dependent. The problem is, not scoring a whole lot of touchdowns with PJ Walker. There's going to be some risk going forward with Amari Cooper until we absolutely see that Deshaun Watson is healthy. For Seattle, DK didn't play in week 7, so Tyler Lockett would have seen a bump in volume, right? No. He actually only played 42 snaps, his second lowest total of the season. What about targets? Maybe he saw the targets and just didn't play as much. Nope. Only 5 targets, his second lowest total on the season. All right, well, it all must have gone to JSN, right? Big, huge breakout game for Jackson Smith and Jigba. Nope, he only played 38 snaps last week. It was Jake Bobo who played a season-high 75% of the snaps and played more snaps than both Tyler Lockett NJSN. And it's not like this was some blowout game. Seattle won the game 20-10. It was within 2 scores. Jackson Smith-Njigba was just saved this past week by a touchdown. Without that, none of the top 3 guys in Seattle would have done anything fantasy relevant. Now they get a matchup going up against Cleveland. They allow 19.2 fantasy points per game, second fewest in the league, and even those numbers are inflated a little bit because of those 2 big plays we talked about in Indianapolis earlier in this show. As of right now, going forward in Week 8, DK Metcalf is still questionable. We do not know whether or not he's going to be on the field. This is going to be a very tough matchup, and with the volume being split like this is, it's an absolute disaster for fantasy football, especially since they're not even throwing the ball a ton. They're finding so much success on the ground, they're not having to throw the ball a lot in Seattle. No one is safe in Seattle going forward until DK Metcalf is 100% healthy. All right, now we're going to go down to Arizona for the Ravens and the Cardinals. And for the first time all year, we just saw Odell Beckham get more targets than Zay Flowers. Now, yeah, it was close, 7-6, but Zay Flowers continues to be the most productive wide receiver in Baltimore, averaging just over 10 fantasy points per game and just over 11 yards per reception. Now, Odell Beckham, he's not looking bad. He's just kind of looking like that short underneath option for Lamar Jackson. Rashad Bateman, not a factor in this offense. Had 2 catches last week. They both came on the same drive, and the dude disappeared rest of the game. For Arizona, they allow over 32 fantasy points per game, 6th most in the league, so you know this is another opportunity for Lamar Jackson to throw the ball to whoever he wants to once again this week. Now, Zay Flowers, in my opinion, is going to remain the safer option in this wide receiver group, and that's going to make him more of a high-end wide receiver, flex play at best here this week. But you know how I've had those gut feelings most of the year, whether it be Gabe Davis or Rashee Rice, they've been right more times than not. And crap, I think I smell an Odell Beckham touchdown this week. Now, does that mean he's some absolute must start? No way whatsoever. He's still a huge risk. I can just see that happening here this week. Now, for Arizona and Marquise Hollywood Brown, the last thing that I ever try to do with anything in Arizona is sniff around for something, right? Because most of the time, when you sniff around this NFL team and this offense, you end up smelling nothing but a huge pile of We've seen here as of late the play of quarterback Josh Dobbs has really fallen off, and that's killed the production of Marquise Hollywood Brown. He's had 18 targets here in the last 2 weeks, but only brought in 7 of them, and he's now been held under 50 yards receiving in back-to-back games. Now they have to worry about a matchup against this Ravens defense that just made the Lions offense look like a group of stray, unfed cats. No, that doesn't make me excited to start Marquise Hollywood Brown this week. Now, Baltimore, they allow 23.8 fantasy points per game, 7th fewest in the league. We did see Amon-Ra kind of go off last week, but is Marquise Hollywood Brown Amon-Ra? I don't know if I want to make that comparison here just yet. Now, we do know that the Arizona Cardinals just lost Zach Ertz to the IR, and that Kyler Murray is going to be making his return somewhere around week 10. But the Cardinals struggle to score. The Ravens don't give up many points, which is an absolute recipe for disaster in week 8. Hollywood is the best option on this team, but the risk is definitely going to be there once again. How about Kansas City and Denver? We'll start off in Kansas City, and you know what? Those feelings we talked about last week, it worked out for Rashee Rice, right? He finishes the wide receiver 15. We finally called a startable wide receiver in Kansas City. That hasn't happened all year long. Rashee Rice led all wide receivers in targets and receptions, and he found the end zone. But is this something that we can just count on weekly going forward? Sadly, no. But I do think we have another chance at him finishing top 30 once again here this week, going up against Denver. There were only 2 wide receivers in Kansas City last week to get over 5 targets. It was Rashee Rice and MVS, but MVS is really going to be big play dependent, where Rice may be a little bit more consistent. Now they get a good matchup going up against Denver. They allow 28.7 fantasy points per game. However, as much as we ragged on this defense to start the year, they have been playing a little bit better here over the last 2 to 3 weeks. There are no new major injuries in Kansas City, and like we all know, these two teams met just a couple weeks ago. In that game, Kansas City won, but it was only 19-8. In that game, Rashee Rice led all Kansas City wide receivers with 72 yards, and it's something I can see similar here in week 8. Like I mentioned, Rashee Rice, the guy going to be inside my top 30 this week. How about for Denver? And good things continue to happen when you throw the ball to Courtland Sutton. He's got touchdowns in 5 of the 7 games this year, but hasn't had over 6 targets in a game since week 3. Why? He's brought in 31 of his 43 targets, and he keeps making big plays all over the field. At this point, a great day for Jerry Jeudy is like 9 fantasy points. It's not like he's taking away from Courtland Sutton. Do you remember Marvin Mims or Brandon Johnson from the beginning of the season? They were getting some big plays. Well, they have a combined 6 targets over the last month of the season. When did Sean Payton lose his balls to throw the ball down the field more? Now, sure, he did it with Drew Brees in the past, but Russell Wilson used to really excel with balls deep down the field, and now we can barely get them in Denver. And now they get another matchup going up against Kansas City, who allows 24.5 fantasy points per game, 9th fewest in the league. And this defense absolutely shut down Denver a couple weeks ago. In that game, Russell Wilson only threw for 95 yards. I had to double check it. 95 yards passing in a game. We also in this offense just lost Greg Dulcich to the IR, but I am convinced that if Courtland Sutton could get 8 to 10 targets a week, he would be a top 12 to 15 wide receiver in fantasy football. He's already the wide receiver 20 overall right now, and the dude is struggling to get targets. This Denver team is just so hard to trust, but if I had to choose one, yes, it is still Courtland Sutton. All right, now Cincinnati and San Francisco. We'll start off with Cincinnati, and let's hope that all the struggles that we saw from the Bengals were left before the bye week, right? Maybe let's start fresh here after their bye week because we need some of these playmakers to absolutely turn it on in the second half of the season. We already know that Jamar Chase, despite the struggles to start the year, is a weekly must start. But what about T. Higgins? Remember, he suffered a rib injury before the bye week, however, still played in week 6 despite it. Now, he may not be 100%, but hopefully with that bye week, he was able to recover and get closer to 100%. Which is great because this guy hasn't had over 21 yards receiving in a game since week 2. And now they get a matchup going up against San Francisco, and everyone starts to flip out a little bit because it's a tough matchup. But they allow over 29 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That is 13th most in the NFL, which is not what a lot of people expect to hear. And we just saw Big Kirko and the Vikings absolutely torch this secondary just last week. And don't forget, prior to the bye week, we saw Joe Burrow look a little bit healthier. He wasn't healthy to start the season, but pre-bye, he started to look a lot better. So you have to think that even he is closer to full health. The Bengals need to make a run, and they know that. They need to get back in rhythm, and they need to make up for their slow start to the season. I expect them to throw the ball a lot this week, I'm sure. If we all watch what the Vikings did to the 49ers, I can guarantee you that the Cincinnati Bengals did as well, and they're going to attack them the same way. It's a lot easier to throw on San Francisco than it is to run on San Francisco, and I expect that throwing to continue. How about for the 49ers? We know that we're not going to have Deebo Samuel once again here this week, so a lot more Brandon Ayuk, right? Well, we didn't see a whole lot more of him in week 7 where he only saw 6 targets, hauled in 5 of them for 57 yards. He was actually out-targeted by Juwan Jennings, who saw 9 targets and brought in 5 of them for 54 yards. And honestly, I can probably see something similar happening again this week. Cincinnati allows 27.4 fantasy points per game. We're still missing offensive tackle, all-world tackle Trent Williams, hoping to have him back this week to help protect Brock Purdy, let those routes develop a little bit longer down the field so we can get more Brandon Ayuk because he's never been a volume guy. He's a big play guy. He's only had 5 games. Listen to this. Only 5 games over the last 3 years in which he's seen 10-plus targets. He's a big play, touchdown type of guy, but he hasn't had a touchdown since week 1, and that needs to change here pretty soon. He should have a few of those opportunities in this game in a potential shootout, especially if Joe Burrow and the Bengals come out firing on all cylinders. All right, now we're going to Chicago and LA, the Chargers game here. And for DJ Moore, he is trying like hell to remain fantasy relevant for all of his fantasy owners out there without Justin Fields. He had 9 targets last week. He brought in 8 of them, but for only 54 yards. He's not going to be getting the deeper balls down the field like he did from Justin Fields with Tyson Bagent, but that's okay if we can make up for it in volume. Remember, DJ Moore and his ability to gain yards after the catch is absolutely elite. It didn't happen last week, but in this matchup, it definitely could happen. He's going to have a great opportunity for it because the Chargers, They allow 37.6 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That is the most in the NFL. This offensive line is still hurting in Chicago. Tyson Bagent didn't look half bad in his first start. You have to expect he's going to gain a little bit more confidence week after week and start to put the ball a little bit deeper down the field with some consistency. I expect the Chargers to put up points in this game, which means the Bears are throwing, and DJ Moore still inside my top 24. How about for Keenan Allen and Josh Palmer? And I'm sure it was disappointing for a lot of Keenan Allen owners to see Josh Palmer basically go out there and double up his fantasy production in week 7. But it's not entirely a bad thing going forward. It's great that opposing defenses have something else to key on other than just Keenan Allen each and every week. And let's not forget, last week was against Kansas City, and that is a super solid defense that has been solid for 7 straight weeks now. This is going to be a much better matchup for them this week, though, going up against Chicago. Keenan still led the team in targets and only had 1 reception less than Palmer last week, so it's not like Josh Palmer's taken over the job for Keenan Allen. No, it's a bad day. It happens. Palmer just seemed to luck out and get the bigger chunk plays. In this matchup going up against Chicago, they allow 29 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Tight end Gerald Everett, he's going to be questionable in this ball game as well. Pay attention to that. We could see maybe another red zone look or two for Keenan Allen without Gerald Everett. That would definitely help boost that floor up a little bit, but both of these guys are probably going to be top 30 plays for me this week in a game in which I expect them to throw a lot. The Bears' run defense is way better than anyone ever wants to talk about. It's much easier to throw on them, to run on them, and that helps the likes of Keenan Allen and Josh Palmer, which will then take us to Monday Night Football, the last game of the week, the Las Vegas Raiders and Detroit Lions. And who gets to be the quarterback for the Las Vegas Raiders this week? Does Jimmy G return? Does Brian Hoyer start, struggle, and get benched? Do we see Aiden O'Connell again? Does Josh McDaniels have any clue what the hell he's doing? There are so many questions in Las Vegas right now here. But one thing is for certain. Both Davante Adams and Jakobi Meyers see plenty of targets week in and week out. Now, are they quality targets? No. For the most part, not all of them are catchable, but at least they're seeing huge volume. Both of them actually rank outside the top 30 wide receivers in catchable target rate. But Las Vegas can't seem to get the running game going, and that's why they're utilizing these wide receivers so much. Now they get a matchup going up against Detroit. They allow 29.5 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and the defense in Detroit is what you would call banged up right now. The Las Vegas secondary themselves, multiple members questionable to play this week. But with all this quarterback crap going on in Las Vegas, it's really lowered the weekly ceilings of Davante Adams and Jakobi Meyers. Luckily, the volume is keeping their floor fairly safe. Now, I do expect them to be losing in this game this week, which means they're going to have to continue to throw the ball in Las Vegas, and Davante Adams, Jakobi Meyers, both probably inside my top 30 as well. For Detroit, it's really Amon-Ra, St. Brown, and nothing else. We're not considering anyone else in this Detroit offense in the passing game, at least at the wide receiver position, because obviously Sam Laporta is a great option. But from the wide receiver position, it's just Amon-Ra St. Brown going forward. Jameson Williams is basically a deep threat decoy at this point, and Amon-Ra soaks up everything else along with Sam Laporta. He actually saw 19 targets last week, did Amon-Ra. And I don't think I need to sit here and sell you on him. I think you already know you're going to start him each and every week. He's a weekly top 12 play, and with that kind of volume, he doesn't even need to score touchdowns, especially in PPR formats. Now, in the matchup going up against Las Vegas, they allow over 24 fantasy points per game, which is actually 8th fewest, but we just mentioned multiple members of that secondary are banged up and questionable to play here this week. We know that David Montgomery is getting a little bit closer to return here in this offense, but nothing's going to get cute for me here in Detroit. It's Amon-Ra St. Brown or nothing for me when it comes to wide receivers in Detroit. But all right, we made it through all 16 matchups here in week 8 for the wide receiver position. Hopefully I was able to give you some information to make some of those decisions a little bit easier. Now, with no bye weeks out there, I have to imagine there's going to be a lot of fantasy players out there with a lot of options here in week 8. Don't forget our rankings will be out Thursday morning to help you make some of those final decisions prior to the Thursday night kickoff game. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day. Hopefully you have a great rest of your day and then do your part to make the world a better place.